It's a pleasure to be welcoming you to this Campbell Institute lecture by Professor Bill Banks, drawing from his new book, Soldiers on the Home Front. Our format today will be to hear from Bill about some of the material and the arguments in the book, and then our Maxwell Dean, Jim Steinberg, will offer some brief reactions. And then I imagine that will drive some additional discussion between the two of them, and then we'll ask you to join in on that conversation with your questions and brief reactions. And we do have microphones for that part, and I'd ask for you to wait for the microphone to come to you before speaking, even though we can probably all still hear you, but that's the way that you'll be part of the video archive of the event. And then we'll wrap up the entire discussion at around 1:30 or so. But let me briefly introduce Bill and the book and Jim. Bill Banks is currently interim dean of SU's College of Law, where he is the Board of Advisors Distinguished Professor. He's also a Maxwell School professor, no less distinguished, in public administration and international affairs. And he's the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism, INSCIT. Bill is a recognized and highly sought after expert on national security, counterterrorism, and international and constitutional law. His new book, Soldiers on the Home Front, The Domestic Role of the American Military, co-authored with Stephen Dicus, provides a grand historical sweep of the domestic uses of the military in response to a variety of challenges, and introduces some difficult current questions regarding that use and the laws that govern it. It's being well received, and most importantly, it's stimulating some important debates about our domestic tranquility and security and our liberties. Our dean, Jim Steinberg, is the ideal person to respond to what Bill shares with us today and to the book itself. As I think most of you know, Jim came to us from the State Department, where he had been Deputy Secretary under Hillary Clinton. His work prior to that includes Director of Foreign Policy Studies at Brookings Institution and Deputy National Security Advisor to President Clinton. But first, of course, Bill, the floor is yours. So welcome and thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Grant. Thanks to the Campbell Institute and to Professor Rear and to Jim Steinberg for hosting the event here in the Maxwell School. It's a real pleasure. I don't get back on this side of the campus as often as I'd like this year. I'm sort of having ankle weight with a magnet attached over at Dineen Hall now, but it's a real pleasure and a great opportunity to talk about a project that I've been involved with for a few years. So imagine that we're off into the not very distant future, say this coming December, perhaps early next January, and that our cities have been victimized by a series of ISIS-inspired terrorist attacks. These would be conventional attacks like those that happened today in Brussels or in Paris or in San Bernardino. Conventional weapons, small groups or individuals or the perpetrators. Several dozen people have been killed in the United States, many more injured. Intelligence and law enforcement have thwarted some attacks, and they've compromised the impacts of others. They've detained some surviving suspects while others remain at large, and Americans everywhere are on edge. Now imagine that as media reports speculate about where the next attack will occur and how many terrorists remain at large, CNN is reporting today that attacks that state and utility officials in the West and Midwest are reporting blackouts and damage to key components of the bulk power system. Apparently, the attackers have blended physical assaults on the system with cyber attacks on the bulk power system itself. As the blackout rolls toward the east, major infrastructure components are failing, and there's some evidence of citizen panic. This is not a far-fetched scenario. How would we respond? Who would be in charge? Would the military be involved? And if so, in what ways? Unsurprisingly, Defense Department doctrine provides for something called complex catastrophes. any natural or man-made incident, I'm now quoting from a DoD doctrinal piece, any natural or man-made incident, including cyber attack, power grid failure, and terrorism, which results in cascading failures of multiple, independent, interdependent, critical life-sustaining infrastructure sectors. In addition, the 2015 DoD Cyber Strategy, which is a public document, one of its strategic goals says, quote, DoD must work with its interagency partners, the private sector, and allied and partner nations to deter, and if necessary, to defeat a cyber attack of significant consequence on the U.S. homeland. Well, what does it mean to defeat this kind of cyber attack? If intelligence links the cyber attack to the conventional terrorist attackers, and thus to ISIS, how would the cyber operation coordinate with combating the terrorists who are using conventional weapons on our soil? Would the military be involved in controlling civil disturbances that might arise? Would they enforce the laws? What are the leadership roles? Where is unity of command in a whole of government response operation? Well, stepping back from the hypothetical, not such a pleasant topic, let me say a few words about the themes of the book. We in the United States have always only cautiously embraced the military at home. We understand the value of a highly disciplined, well-equipped, experienced fighting force to defend against foreign invaders or to help out when civilian authorities are overwhelmed by domestic violence or natural disasters. But we've also recognized that even under civilian control, those forces hold the potential for mischief. Elbridge Gerry, who was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, put it this way. He said, standing armies in time of peace are inconsistent with the principles of republican governments, dangerous to the liberties of the people, and generally converted into destructive engines for establishing despotism. A few weeks ago, one of the reviewers of our new book wrote in Secrecy News, this was Steve Aftergood, he said this, the role of the armed forces in an open society might be likened to a potent medicine that is life-saving in the proper dosage, but lethal beyond a certain proportion. Military forces have proved to be indispensable for securing the political space in which free institutions may flourish, but they may also trample or destroy those institutions if unconstrained by law and wise leadership. So our new book focuses on the domestic activities of the U.S. military today and in the future, but to help readers understand the significance of those activities for national security, civil liberties, and representative government. We also review the colorful history of military involvement in domestic affairs. I have an excerpt here that I might read. This is what the book looks like, by the way, Army Green. The cover image are soldiers from 82nd Airborne marching on Bourbon Street in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. This excerpt focuses on someone who you know from history, Andrew Jackson, speaking of New Orleans. This is about the tail end of the War of 1812. And there's a page or page and a half here that I thought might be illuminating of the themes that I've just mentioned. When Jackson was made commander of American troops in New Orleans during the last stages of the war, he feared an imminent attack from a large British force which was nearby. So Jackson declared martial law in December of 1814 and assumed full control of the city and its civilian population. When the British invaders were then defeated in a storied Battle of New Orleans a short time later, the war had already formally ended. Although official word of the Treaty of Ghent had not reached the city for another 2 months. Until it did, Jackson refused to lift martial law in the city. There was a state senator in Louisiana then named Louis Lallier who wrote a letter, unsigned but published widely, objecting to the continuation of military rule, which he described as, quote, no longer compatible with our dignity and the oath of making the Constitution respected. In particular, he argued that persons accused of a crime in New Orleans should be tried in civilian court, not by military tribunals. Jackson responded by having Lallier arrested on the pretextual charge of spying and other offenses. So there's a federal judge, Dominic Augustine Hall, who issued a writ of habeas corpus for Lallier after finding that local conditions no longer justified martial law. Unbowed, Jackson ordered the judge arrested and detained in the same barracks as Lallier on the grounds that Hall had aided and abetted Lallier in inciting mutiny in the Army. The general also ordered the U.S. Marshal not to interfere. At Jackson's direction, a court-martial was convened to try Lallier. Well, the military judges acquitted Lallier, concluding that the military court had no jurisdiction to try someone who was not a member of the militia or the Army, and that there was no evidence to support the charge of spying. Jackson ignored the acquittal, kept Lallier in confinement, and anticipating a court-martial would also acquit Judge Hall, he ordered soldiers to remove the judge from the city. So the general continued martial law until he was officially notified of the proclamation of peace on March 13th of the year 1815. Judge Hall immediately returned to New Orleans and cited Jackson for contempt. Jackson appeared in the civilian court then, and he argued that martial law gave him the right to control both the military and civilian functions of the city. Then he said, even if his conduct was technically unlawful, he insisted that necessity, quote, may in some cases justify a departure from the Constitution. District Attorney responded that while necessity might justify extra-constitutional measures, the record clearly showed there was no necessity during the period when Jackson ordered the military trial of Lallier. Following a hearing in which Jackson appeared in civilian clothes, Judge Hall held Jackson in contempt, fined him $1,000. Jackson submitted to civilian authority and paid the fine out of his own funds. So the story goes on for a while. A quarter century later, 25 years later, an aging Andrew Jackson appeared in Washington, traveled to Washington to lobby Congress for a rebuke of Judge Hall's contempt ruling in his case. After an intensely partisan debate between the Democrats and Whigs that stretched over 2 years, Congress obliged in 1844 by voting to refund the $1,000 fine with interest. In effect, it retroactively ratified Jackson's imposition of martial law, as well as the military trial of civilians who criticized the military operation, casting doubt on the nation's commitment to the primacy of civilian authority for the Army. Well, that's a pretty good story. There are lots of others sort of like it in the book, but let me say a few other things about the book and about the themes. So U.S. Armed Forces have been, I need some water, have been most active in domestic life, unsurprisingly, in times of great crisis. At times, the armed forces have done what no other entity or institution in our government could do. They've saved lives, saved citizens from death or serious injury in the face of disaster or disturbance. At other times, however, their actions have threatened the very interests that they're sworn to protect: civil liberties, representative government, and the rule of law. So from the earliest days of the Republic, Americans have developed what we call a dependent yet uneasy relationship with the military. The tensions in the relationship are at the heart of the book and the study that we made. Except in extraordinary circumstances, engaging the military in a domestic operation cuts against our cultural grain, never mind the law. The United States has been proudly unique in entrusting law enforcement to civilian forces, managed and controlled by civilians. Our federal system has helped cement civilian control and accountability for law enforcement and peacekeeping at the lowest levels of government, closest to the operations being conducted. And of course, our revolutionary and constitutional heritage, fed by experiences in England and with the English military in the colonies, led to the unequivocal subordination of the military to civilian authority. Our basic law, the Constitution, anticipates that military forces may be required for domestic missions in extraordinary circumstances, including invasion, insurrection, and other forms of domestic violence. The framers also knew that troops would sometimes be needed to help enforce the civilian laws. They just neglected to tell us precisely when. So a few of the high points of the constitutional framework that guide us in this area, based on their familiarity with the dangers of a standing army in England, the framers determined to provide for the nation's security while safeguarding against overreach by the military. To do so, they employed the concept that all of us know about called separation of powers to avoid aggregation of power in any one branch of government, and they approved a federal system to share responsibility for internal security between national government and the states. They created a civilian commander-in-chief, a critical point, making the military less likely to seize control of the government. They gave Congress, rather than the president, the power to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy. They then cemented further the financial, fiscal appropriations powers in Congress. Indeed, Supreme Court Justice Jackson said much later that, quote, while Congress cannot deprive the president of the command of an army and navy, only Congress can provide him an army or navy to command. An important point. The preamble to our Constitution declares that among its goals are to ensure domestic tranquility and provide for the common defense. This acknowledges, I think, a federal responsibility for the security of the states, and through its open-ended terms, a recognition that the responsibility would be shared with the states. The Constitution also gives Congress the power to provide for calling forth the militia, that's today's National Guard, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Notice that the Constitution doesn't directly authorize that call-up. It allows Congress to provide for it. And Congress has done so on many occasions from the very beginning. State forces may also be called in national service, excuse me, in these specified emergencies. Finally, the guarantee clause in Article 4 of our Constitution states that the U.S. shall guarantee to each state in the Union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or executive against domestic violence. So yet another instance where it's expected that federal troops may be involved in protecting internal security. Much was left to Congress and future administrations to work out. When would the feds call up state forces? What does it mean exactly to, quote, execute the laws? Which laws? The mechanisms for the use of the military in these settings are, for the most part, very tightly controlled by statute and by regulation, and they are subject to civilian decision-making. Even after centuries of legislation, litigation, and historical experience, however, many of the underlying policy questions and some of the basic legal issues remain at least partly unresolved. The overarching themes of our book are that Americans have only cautiously embraced a military role at home, even when civilian resources are overwhelmed, and that the martial orientation of the military can cause considerable harm to our freedoms even while they're keeping us safe from enemies. That the original legal framework for domestic use of the military and its subordination to civilian control has eroded over time, leading to expanding military influence, and that our civilian political leaders have in the past abused their legal authorities in misusing the military for domestic assignments and could again in the future. We also review recent and not so recent historical examples of the use of military forces in civilian disturbance and law enforcement operation, domestic intelligence collection, the imposition of martial law, and the detention and trial of civilians. We do take a look in the last two chapters of the book at post-9/11 environment for military's involvement in domestic security, taking a look at these things we called complex catastrophes at the beginning, and we try to sort out roles and relationships between other agencies in the government like Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. Throughout the book, we're careful to point out instances where the military has unquestionably promoted domestic tranquility. Hurricane Katrina is one good example. Our goal, I think, in the book overall is to help Americans recognize that while military forces play a critical role in keeping us safe, history demonstrates that the expanded military involvement in civilian affairs poses distinct risks to liberty and to democracy. We hope that if lawmakers read the book, they might be prompted to enact measures that will better balance the risks and benefits in accordance with the rule of law. I have lots of anecdotes and examples from the book that I could share, but I think I've rambled on for long enough. So thanks, and I look forward to Jim's comments and discussion.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks all for being here and for the chance to talk about this very important and thoughtful book that characteristically Professor Banks has authored with Steve Dicus. I want to take a slightly different cut at this, to sort of look at this from a contemporary standpoint to try to frame how I think the problem emerges in our current environment and some of the challenges that we face today. I think it's first important to ask ourselves the question is, why is it that we do turn to the military for these kinds of activities? Professor Banks mentioned Katrina. There are a number of other circumstances. Why is it that we have, in fact, got a problem in the first place? And I think for those of you who study the operations of government, especially in the federal government in contemporary times, it's pretty obvious as to how this situation has emerged, because many of the functions that the military either currently plays or might play in a crisis are really a function of how certain capabilities ended up being in the military in the first place. Many of the things that we worry about, and in the scenarios that Bill talked about, you could imagine the capabilities residing someplace else, right? I mean, if the issue is, in a crisis, how do you get large quantities of potable water to a people whose water supply has been destroyed by floods or hurricanes, it isn't military or martial, in Bill's sense, that you need to do it, but who has a fleet of large transport airplanes available to do that, who can mobilize them quickly and provide these resources. Similarly, if you think about some of the other issues that might arise in a terrorist attack, intelligence and information. The activities that we now conduct through the NSA and others happen to reside in the military, but there's nothing martial about what the NSA does. One could imagine an environment in which those functions of signals intelligence were performed by a civilian agency, just as with atomic weapons, we chose a long time ago to make the nuclear weapons establishment a civilian organization under the AEC rather than the military. But because the military commands a great deal of respect, we know that in terms of trying to get resources for functions and capability, you're more likely to persuade Congress if it's coming from the military that says we need it than coming from a civilian agency. Similarly, in terms of being able to be agile, effective, quick in response, a military organization based on strong command and control and authority is far more likely to respond, a unitary organization, than a complex network of state, local, federal, and private entities all trying to respond in real time or near real time to a crisis. And so what's happened for these understandable reasons is that over time a range of capabilities have ended up in the military which are not martial in nature, but which have made the military the kind of the vehicle of choice to respond to these crises. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, how much of a problem is this in terms of the historical concerns that Professor Banks? Does it really matter in a contingency if there were a crisis and there was a need to airlift supplies or vaccines or potable water, whether it's a civilian agency or the military doing it? Is the fact that it's a military a threat? And can we parse out the differences between those functions where the fact that it is being carried out by a military poses a particular problem, and those where, while we might prefer to have a civilian agency do it, the fact that it's a military organization by itself doesn't seem so dangerous? And I think that's the key question that the book poses, is to help us think about what are the circumstances and the functions where if it's being done by the military, we would worry. And the anecdotes and the stories that Professor Banks has talked about helps us identify those things. The circumstances in which, where the military culture or the military instincts are antithetic to other important values. And in particular, we've seen this in the context of law enforcement, and why the greatest danger, in my mind, lies in those circumstances where the temptation in a law enforcement type situation to go to the military is particularly troubling. Why? Because we know in the case of the law enforcement paradigm that we use in our country that we are sufficiently concerned about civil liberties and the protections in our Bill of Rights that we're prepared to let guilty people go rather than to have innocent people treated badly. In the military context, which is focused largely on prevention and protection, those same norms don't apply. And so as I think going forward and we think about this debate about the role of the military in complex contingencies and terrorist attacks in the United States, it will be important to distinguish between those functions where, for better or worse, the capability lies in the military, and while one could imagine it being better in the civilian side, the risks to our fundamental values and interests are not particularly implicated. And those circumstances when we really have to think twice about the kinds of dangers that Bill talked about. And I think that's the conversation which hasn't been had much because we haven't had too many circumstances in which we would have to deal with it. But we have seen this in the context of the use of military tribunals to deal with terrorists, which gives us a window into the problem that we might face in a truly serious multidimensional catastrophe, particularly involving terrorism and cyber.
Yeah, that's great. I think focusing on these contemporary instances and looking at capabilities is a good frame of reference, to answer some of the questions that Dean Steinberg's comments raise. Why not simply allow the military to supplant a civilian agency if it's got greater resources and capabilities? If they're the most widely dispersed entity in our society, they are. They are our friends and our neighbors in our communities when you count the National Guard and the reserves. Wouldn't you rather have the Guard and the reserves who live down the street from you enforcing the laws in a tough situation than overstretched civilian police or highway patrol? The answer might be yes, but the orientation of the soldier in almost every instance is not law enforcement. They're not giving considerable training and background in law enforcement techniques. It's not their instinct, as Jim said just a moment ago, to protect the innocent at the risk of letting someone go. Their instinct is quite different. So unless their training is flipped, there's a considerable effort to provide sort of homeland security training for military forces. They would call it homeland defense. Then that danger remains. Similarly, on the matter of just a response to a crisis here, even though DOD has made considerable headway, say in the last 20 years, at building its domestic response capabilities in theoretical partnership with the other civilian agencies, DHS and a whole range of others, there remains, as many of you know, a separate command structure. The military will not give up its chain of command to fold into a larger domestic response unity of command operations. So in the most recent kinds of exercises and games that have been rehearsed to try to consider the possibility of serious domestic incidents, including cyber and others, there continue to be sort of headbutting or a lack of coordination demonstrated between DOD and civilian agencies in figuring out how to conduct these responses.
I think, as Professor Banks has indicated, I mean, the exercises are very important because in many ways you can't really anticipate where these problems are going to arise until you kind of run through the scenarios and you see the tensions that develop about how different actors have different approaches to these problems and that they have different instincts about what to prioritize, what to worry about. And I think in particular the one that Bill identified, which is there's a danger here too that if if in attempt to rectify the problem, that we try to teach the military to be like police rather than the military, we lose the real value of the military as military. And that's why many military commanders will tell you that even though there's a lot of fear about somehow the military is going to try to take over and impose themselves, actually most leaders in the services want nothing to do with this, precisely because they don't want to change the orientation, the martial orientation of their troops to do what they want to do. And so the military is often the biggest advocate for developing the capacity on the civilian side, simply not to have to conflate these two different kinds of worldviews.
Right. You know, some reformers have suggested sort of a half measures here to make a contemporary response operation more effective without undermining the principle of the martial orientation military. That is to use select units of the National Guard or the reserves who would be specifically trained and made available for these kind of operations. But as we all know, in recent history, in the Iraq-Afghanistan campaigns, for example, Guard and Reserve units are called up and deployed in those traditional battlefield situations. So it's very difficult to simply say, okay, New York, your homeland, when New York may be deployed halfway around the globe.
And of course, I mean, there are other alternatives, and we're very conscious of this as we look now at the attacks today in Brussels and in Paris a few weeks ago, which is that many of our European partners have developed a third force, right, the gendarmerie, a kind of national police force, which brings some of the capabilities of the military, highly mobilizable, highly trained, well-resourced, but still specifically trained for this, who aren't martial in their orientation. And that's something we have declined to do as a country. There are a variety of reasons for why we've declined to do that, some of them rooted in the very early history that Bill talked about. But over time, we've had a lot of conversation about whether we need to rethink some of the basic paradigms. It includes both on the intelligence side and on the operational side. Is, you know, why don't we have the equivalent of the MI5, the British MI5 here on the intelligence side, which is a domestic intelligence service, which is not military, but is counterterrorism? Why don't we have a paramilitary or a gendarmerie, which has some of the capabilities that military forces have, but are very much trained within the paradigm of civilian forces? Right.
So, you know, the hypothetical that I opened with was meant just to get your attention, but it's not so far-fetched. And if you think about just how the response would roll out in the event of escalating conventional terrorist attacks, and then mixed with something dramatic like a cyber event of national significance that threatens trunk power in many parts of the United States, the answer to the question is whether the military would be involved is yes. And the how, the parameters, is not known, not been well sorted. Defense officials, other civilians will admit that there are details yet to work out. So it deserves, I think, considerable attention, not necessarily from lawmakers, but from citizens and from groups that would help make the plans and planning decisions that would effectuate a rational response to such a crisis.
Well, I guess I should follow my own rules and wait for the microphone. But, oh, there they are. I want to ask a question that builds directly off of what both of you have said, and then we'll see with the audience.
Good.
It just jumps off of something you said briefly, Bill, and also something that Jim had said early on. You know, we live in an age right now where there has been a steep decline in public trust in just about all institutions, but certainly our governing institutions, Congress, even the courts, and the police. My impression is that the military has not been hit as heavily in that steep public decline of trust. Does that change how you would see this playing out in the future in one of these situations that you sketch out, given that the public has this reservoir of distrust in just about every other public institution?
I don't think so. I think, as Jim indicated a moment ago, that the military don't want these jobs. The starting point is for disengagement from homeland assignments. But indeed, in kind of crisis that I spun out and in many others, like the ones Jim indicated, the military would have to be involved. Historically, in the book, we are pretty careful to say that there have been very, very few instances in our history where the military have directly asserted themselves into a civilian operation without the direction or order of a civilian official, a governor, president, sometimes subordinate officials, a mayor of a town. There are examples that would make your hair stand on end, but they're almost always not at the instance of the officer himself. Jackson is a fairly rare exception. So I don't think that's likely to occur, and I think the trust, the fact that it's still at an elevated level relative to other public institutions is in part a reflection of that fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have much of a Praetorian tradition here in the United States. I mean, the fear, you can understand why the founders had this fear in the context of the role in which the governors of the colonies played and the role that the military played in support of the governors. But from early on, and with a few exceptions, including during the Civil War, you know, the military hasn't played much of a role, and it has almost never come from kind of Douglas MacArthur type characters who would challenge the authority of the civilians and try to, you know, use the military and military prestige against the government, which is how coups and military takeovers take place in many other parts of the world. So that hasn't been, and I think today absolutely is not a fear. The last thing one would worry about is the troops coming out of the barracks to, you know, take over the civilian government. So that traditional fear of the military, I think, is not present. But I also think, and you know this well, is that another part of our debate, which has less to do with the military per se, but this broader question of the militarization of law enforcement is a fear and a concern. And so there is, I think, as much as people trust the military, I think there's a little bit of fear about the sort of the military tactics being transferred to our civilian forces, the military gear that the police forces, and the backlash against that. Not to mention the backlash in the post-Snowden era against some of the other techniques that are seen associated with NSA and others. So I don't think this is a situation where there's a clamor for them to step in. Having said all that, in the event of a huge, really catastrophic event, it's very hard to predict what would happen. And I think if you know, you had a serious breakdown as a result of either conventional or non-conventional terrorism and real disorder, there may be, you know, a demand for a different kind of response from an institution which is seen as not responsible for the breakdown and which can respond and restore order.
Who wants to jump in? Right here.
I wonder if you might comment on the use of private security organizations, and I'm thinking of Blackwater in New Orleans. A lot of them are ex-military, run by the military, and they have been used. Would they be used, and how would they be used?
I think that the concerns that most Americans have had about private security companies have been their involvement in operations abroad, not here in the United States. There may be some in the United States, and those, to the extent there are, these are contracts that are let through civilian agencies of the government, and the theory is that they would be overseen by Congress, so that the contracts would be enabled by statute. When the Blackwater scandal broke in Iraq, what, 2007 or so, there was a fair amount of attention given to the way that those contracts are supervised and the way they're let, subject to legislation, and there have been some tightening of the legislative strictures on that, and the amount of contracting has decreased pretty considerably as our involvement in those operations abroad has cut back as well. So very little of it domestically, actually.
Yeah, I know.
Hey, sir. Good afternoon, Pat County. I came because I was told there was going to be a debate afterwards.
Oh, I thought you came because of the food.
That too. Hey, sir, one of your recommendations is really, I think, interesting from a standpoint, maybe not from the standpoint you meant it to be, but you suggested creating more robust domestic forces with kind of a mixing with the Reserve and National Guard.
Yeah.
Which would be ideal. Obviously, there's some challenges there with control and all that. But one of the things I think that would allow us to do is kind of stay in line with how we're told to do operations, where we're geared towards, and that is of short duration, a limited footprint, but more than anything, the ability within that force to leverage the civilian capabilities.
That's right.
And I think some of that would feed into your other idea of making sure, controlling the controllers, making sure they're aware of what exactly they have so that they're not asking us to do something beyond the scope. But I just wondered if you'd care to comment a little bit more on that.
Well, thanks, Pat. Many of you know Colonel Pat County, who's United States Army, who's with us for a year on a senior service fellowship over at Inskit, and he's been a really valuable contributor. And he was a star student in Professor O'Keefe and my seminar this last fall. That's why he's asking for the debate. We should give him an opportunity, but you lobbed a softball, and for that I'm grateful. Yeah, some people have gone to some length to recommend a force like the one that you roughly described, Larry Korb, among others, and politically these proposals fall flat, don't get past first base. But in analogy to the force that Dean Steinberg described, that it goes on with regularity in Europe, we could develop such a force here, and you could do it without interference with our existing institutions by drawing from Guard and Reserve and drawing then on civilian expertise, as you indicate. That's really probably the strongest selling point here. You could bring more civilians in, providing them protections, liability protections and the like, so that if they volunteer for service and something bad happens, that they're not personally responsible for that occurrence. You know, I think over time that may well gain some strength as an idea here because of the tendencies of the military to retain its own chain of command and structure and the like, rightly so, and the need to better coordinate an operational response to a crisis that involves military capabilities, whether they're individuals wearing uniforms or not. And it could be in the specific functional areas like WMD response or cyber or others, but it could be more generally in a response to a disaster, even say a bad storm or a water crisis or something like that. So, you know, politically it's not palatable right now, but I think it could become more so in the future.
Thanks for this. This is very interesting. I want to suggest maybe that the trust of the military isn't so strong in the domestic context. If we think back to last summer, there was this Jade Helm 15 operation in the Southwest, and the governor of Texas deployed, I think it was Texas Rangers, to monitor the activities to protect the civil liberties of Texans. I wonder if you see a role for the military to sort of normalize their presence in the domestic context in terms of emergency response.
Yeah.
If this is something that they need to be actively planning.
Yeah, well, look at who the culprit was there. It was the civilian. It was the governor. The military were following orders. And Pat used a phrase a moment ago that we use in the book quite a lot. It's called controlling the controllers. And we're worried about that in this society. And the example of the governor of Texas is a poster child, if you will, for that very phenomenon. So the military did what they were ordered to do. The governor misbehaved. So what are the mechanisms inside the state of Texas to make sure that the governors don't disobey constitutional or other legal requirements in the state? That's, certainly that incident is not the only one we've got incidents, I could have written a separate chapter about Texas. The governors over time have done some pretty extraordinary things in the state of Texas. Yeah.
I think there was also an incident. I saw a community meeting in rural Texas where there was an Army captain, I think, who came to explain the meeting, and there were rural Texans saying that he was a liar in this community meeting. So I certainly see what you're saying about the civilians being partially to blame.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's not a role for the military, though, to step in and say, look, even if there are some civilian actors who are sort of suggesting nefarious motives, we're here to do responsible sorts of response.
Yeah, well, that's a nice point, and maybe so. Military are citizens like the rest of us and have a responsibility to behave lawfully and to be responsible citizens in a democracy, and they should and may speak out. You've seen a fair amount of attention given to that in the presidential campaign now, and this active military and retired military signing letters indicating that they would not follow an unlawful order from President Trump, for example, to use lethal force against the family members of combatants, or to torture detained persons, or to exclude from the borders of the United States persons on the basis of their religion or their race or their ethnicity. Military, like the rest of us, would not participate knowingly in unlawful conduct, and it would be proper for them to take that position. That's quite a strong public statement, particularly for someone who's wearing a uniform today. It makes them vulnerable in many ways.
I'd like to thank you both for your interesting and timely remarks. And I'm just wondering how you both look at the prospect of a President Trump being the commander-in-chief and what implications that might have for the domestic situation here in the U.S. of law enforcement and protection of civil liberties.
Do you want to be in his cabinet?
I take my institutional role here seriously, and so I tend to stay out of calling balls and strikes on presidential campaigns. But I do think, the issues that Professor Banks raised are serious ones, and I think people will need to reflect on, what the implications are in terms of how various candidates see the issues that we've been talking about today.
Yeah. I think we ought to leave it at that. You could tell what I think about the prospect of a President Trump.
It's nice to have it on the record, though.
Yes, so it's on the record.
Thank you very much. You use the term military so much, and it's a large umbrella. So perhaps we could break it down some, and looking again toward the Constitution, under congressional responsibilities, it specifically states we maintain navies and we raise armies. And I think we've gotten away from that. So going along with that is we already have a Navy and Marine Corps, and I know the debates come up in some circles. The former Chief of Naval Operations, Gary Roughead, has called for an army of under 300,000, and nowhere in there has it mentioned anything about domestic security, whereas the Chief of the Army, former Chief of the Army, Odierno, has called for an army upwards to 600,000, talking about domestic support. And I think that argument is decided by, when you look at the militia, which the Constitution calls for, is a Title 32 by U.S. Code function, and really isn't military at all, as it would be like calling the Coast Guard military. So that's the way that argument is solved. There could be absolutely no need for a large army that we have, and especially supporting domestic security, when that can easily reside in the militia, as it's called for in the Constitution. So so please comment about maintaining navies and raising armies.
Can I say I've been involved in a lot of budgetary planning for the Army. And at no point is any of the sizing of the Army related to the domestic contingency. I mean, you can argue about whether you need a smaller one, but what's driven it is the Iraq War and Afghanistan and the need for rotational deployments and the like. I think it would be difficult to find in any of the Army sizing documents something that, I don't know the specific comment you're referring to from General Odierno, but I do know a lot about the military planning, and almost all the sizing is based on foreign contingencies. You're right about raising armies, but these are, and that's for Congress to decide, but Congress is the one that has decided. And so this is, I mean, it is Congress exercising its constitutional role in deciding what size army to engage, including the requirement of annual appropriations.
Mm-hmm. And recall that that the modern militia, the National Guard, is a product of the states, and it would be up to each state to determine its size, resources available, training and configuration, special assignments. Some have done more than others, and some, as we know, have been very heavily deployed as part of the regular military abroad. You're mentioning the Coast Guard is interesting because in modern times it's possible in some situations that the Coast Guard can become part of the military by statute. There's a designation that can occur. The Coast Guard is a very flexible, adaptable force that's capable, of course, of doing many things and has performed brilliantly in some domestic situations, including Hurricane Katrina. But that's a special circumstance, and it suggests, like the question here a moment ago, that it would be possible for Congress to create special forces that are responsive to domestic crises from among the militia, the State Guard, or reserves, or other forces that are configured, including the Coast Guard. Coast Guard's a tiny force in relation to the Army or the Navy, of course, but it's exemplary.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. You mentioned, Dean Steinberg, the militarization of the police. And I was wondering if you could comment on, the use, over the last 10, 15 years, certainly after 9/11, a lot of police departments have gotten equipment like tanks and tactical weapons and extra training, I mean, which is, I guess, yeah, and even for going in for small-time weed dealers, a lot of police departments have resorted to, SWAT teams to go in and get a 16-year-old for weed in certain cases. Do you think that, maybe it's not the fact that we're past the time, or we don't think so much about the military getting involved domestically, but rather we've just empowered the police so much where they're acting as the military, preventive measures, as Dean Banks mentioned that militaries usually do in their role. Some police departments have checkpoints in certain communities and stuff like that, stopping everybody on this street or in this corner in this community. I just want to know if you would comment on that.
So I need to be careful about not commenting beyond where my expertise lies, and I'm obviously not an expert on policing in America or some of the issues that you raised. But the part that I do know, and where I have some insight and some sensitivity to the issues that you raise, is in the role that police have now played as part of the broader counterterrorism effort. So I'm not talking about, I really don't know about kind of traditional law enforcement. But there is a deep challenge now, right, which is that the police in our communities are the front line of counterterrorism, right? That although the federal agencies, play a role in collecting national intelligence, the truth is, by far and away, the most important agencies involved in protecting against terrorism within the United States are domestic law enforcement organizations, the NYPD, the LAPD. And so what's happening now is those are the people who have responsibility for keeping their community safe. The military doesn't. The federal government, for the most part, doesn't. And that's posing a challenge because it is a different kind of problem than the traditional law enforcement problems about responding to burglaries or, auto thefts or whatever. And so there's a changing dynamic within police forces as they focus more on prevention and detection than they do on apprehension, right, which is kind of the old-fashioned model, the theory that if you capture suspects after the fact, that will deter them because they know they'll get captured. But now, in the counterterrorism context, we're much more focused on prevention, which raises big civil liberties questions because the very nature of the prevention exercise is very different than innocent until proven guilty. You can't wait in the prevention context, although we have, you know, the conspiracy laws. So now we have this kind of conflation within our police forces of both a apprehension post facto framework and a prevention before the fact. And I think, so at least in the CT context, this is a problem. And how do we, on the one hand, recognize that we must engage, the police have to be involved in making us safe against potential terrorist attacks, but still preserve this kind of mindset, the law enforcement mindset that presumes innocence, that requires, you know, acts rather than bad intentions in order to apprehend. So that part is really, I think, a big challenge for us as a society.
And our last question here, I think, from this former government official who traveled both the civilian and the military side.
Who might that be? You got somebody else in mind? Well, first and foremost, Bill, congratulations on a terrific contribution, I think, to the literature, the scholarly work, as well as the dialogue on this question, which really has, I think, as you've accurately pointed out in the historical trace of this piece, has bedeviled, I think, the conversation and debate throughout the country for the entire history of the Republic. In contemporary, more modern circumstances, what we've typically found, and again, I think, Jim, as you mentioned very accurately, there has been not only a reticence or reluctance on the part of the military to engage in nationalized federal kinds of circumstances in which the use of U.S. military forces to deal with domestic-related kind of activities has not only been an aversion, it's been outright, you know, arm's length distance from it. They have gone to great lengths to avoid it and typically have avowed on the front end that they want absolutely nothing to be done with being nationalized in this circumstance. It is a part of our cultural fabric that has been instilled in U.S. military officers that this is the last set of circumstances we ever want to see is the use of the military against our own citizens. That has been, you know, part of the bulwark. That said, the circumstances, rare as they are, as you pointed out, I think as a historical matter, Bill, in which nationalized or federalized circumstances have been required to deal with a range of domestic incidents, typically what's occurred in those cases is a considerable lag time of decision to actually engage. And in that lag time, the situation has gone from bad to worse. Inevitably, in every one of the contemporary events we've seen, this usually is contributed because of either a failure of the capacity that exists at a state and local level to respond to the emergency or crisis circumstance has been inadequate, really, to address the case, or there's been a complete collapse of the continuity of government. And that's precisely the case with Katrina. It has, from the state level on down, there was absolute gridlock as well as dissolution of authority at the state and local levels that brought about the event. And ultimately, when that nationalized condition did occur that began to rectify and stabilize the situation, the most resounding thing that has withstood the test of time is the criticism of how long it took before that action was taken. So inasmuch as a matter of public opinion, we have an aversion to the very idea of calling in the U.S. military to deal with any domestic event. Nonetheless, when the events do occur, it is our first public opinion solution to be leapt to when we see either a dissolution of continuity of government or a failure of capacity to deal with it at the state and local level. And it is that period of time from the event beginning to the time in which that event has occurred as a nationalized matter that has garnered the most amount of criticism over time and ultimately has, as a matter of public opinion, withheld that the federal action was inadequate and too late. Now, as a policy construct, that's a no-win proposition. Is there a mechanism that you can envision that would organize as a policy construct when and how promptly that could be affected when a crisis does emerge? The debate is over, the circumstances hit itself, and at what point can you trigger that action to be more timely and responsive, by definition, event in which that could be addressed?
That's a great question. Thanks to Professor O'Keefe, and then Chancellor of Louisiana State University when the storm struck. Time is of the essence. So I think the answer is theoretically yes in two different ways. You could blend, the military could give up its chain of command, the traditional chain, and blend a unity of command with several civilian responders at the most senior level so that decisions could be made more efficaciously. It's not going to happen, that departure from the traditional chain of command. You can build structures that will allow for a notional unity of command, maintaining the traditional chain, and then have those structures in place in the event of a crisis, but it then counts on the efficacy of very prudent, wise, thoughtful civilian leadership in those circumstances, right? Everybody knows that in our society, decisions in a crisis are harder to make than they are in France or in Belgium because of the nature of our government. The federal system, the governor of Louisiana was not an A-plus player when Katrina struck, nor the governor of Mississippi. And not only the governors, but other officials, health and public safety, police, National Guard from the state level up to the national. One device that's been, I think, made more efficacious since Katrina is the compact as a legal mechanism. We have things called interstate compacts in the United States that are recognized by the Constitution. There's an EMAC, an Emergency Management Assistance Compact now that's available in all 50 states. And indeed, the EMAC did deploy Guard forces, but 8, 10, 12 days after the fact in Katrina. It took a long time. As you know, General Honore's force was in the region ready to enter the city before the storm hit, but didn't get the go-ahead until 2 or 3 days after, and by which time it was much more difficult. The EMAC could be triggered like that, and again, it's civilian decision makers who have to make the call. So I think these exercises, and Jim commented about the exercises too, are testing the efficacy of that kind of structure most recently. Ones that are complex catastrophes, cyber and something else, or health and conventional destruction. And they could get better.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct is along the same line as Bill's, which is that since Katrina, we've seen a lot more thinking about pre-positioning the decisional protocols to make these decisions, and the Homeland Security directives and things like that, so that I mean, it's still going to require an individual decision, but there's a rota that people understand to turn to quickly. You know, if I'm going to do this, you know, there's the book on the shelf that goes through and says, here's the capabilities, here are the decisions, here are the authorities, here's the capabilities, so that you have it there. And it's not a kind of a pickup game, because I think part of the problem is the reluctance, but part of the problem is that there wasn't, it was a kind of oh my gosh situation, as opposed to, oh yeah, this is, you know, version 3C, let's do that one. Now, of course, reality never completely corresponds to the 3C, but I do think, and these are probably famous last words, that we are better prepared for having thought about what tools to reach for in these kinds of contingencies, because we now take them as more likely to happen than we used to, right? And therefore, you know, are not black swans, but really sort of, we now sort of assume, I mean, I think everybody in government now assumes that in their lifetime, and probably during the term of their service, something dreadful is going to happen that's going to be a complex emergency that's going to entail these things. And so just the fact that people take that more seriously, understand the need to have some at least preliminary kind of game plans in place, increases the chance that we're not going to have the delay that you correctly characterized past instances.
And speaking of controlling the controller, Sean remembers others in this room will as well, that within the weeks and months after, in the aftermath of Katrina, I think it was General Eberhard who said, you know, maybe we ought to think about just making the military the lead federal agency in an event of a crisis like this. Bush administration then proposed an amendment to the statute that enables these kinds of deployments, called the Insurrection Act. Congress obliged. There were no hearings. It was a silent kind of maneuver that caught the governors and the state National Guard leaders by surprise completely, and they amended the act for a year that essentially gave the president carte blanche without the involvement of the governors. The next year, when the governors and the state guard folks weighed in, the Congress repealed the amendment to the Insurrection Act, and we're back to these kind of mechanisms that Jim described.
Bill, let me just echo Sean's thanks to you for writing such a timely and important book, and I want to thank Jim also for his insightful reactions to it and for the discussion. And I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say, as a way of concluding, that I hope the hypothetical that you began with remains, if realistic, still a hypothetical. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Grant.